Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read the last chapter of Poisoner in Chief. It's called You Can Never Know What He Was. In 1983, 20 years after the Kubark Manual was written, the CIA produced a new version called Human Resources Exploitation Manual. It was intended specifically for use by military dominated governments in Latin America. Among the first public forces to receive it were those in Honduras and El Salvador, both when known for extreme brutality. Green Beret trainers later brought it to other countries where torture was commonly practiced. It became the basis for 7 texts tailored to individual countries, all based on the principle that interrogators should manipulate the subject's environment in order to create intolerable situations to disrupt patterns of time, space, and sensory perception. The most complete the deprivation, the more rapidly and deeply the subject is affected. Techniques described in the Human Resources Exploitation Training Manual are strikingly similar to those in the Kubark Manual. While we do not stress the use of coercive techniques, the manual says we do want to make you aware of them and the proper way to use them. One CIA officer who trained Latin American interrogators in techniques described in these manuals, his name has not been declassified, went on to become chief of interrogations for the CIA Rendition Group, which was formed after the 9/11 terror attacks on 2001 and charged with kidnapping suspected terrorists and sending them to secret prisons for interrogation. His presence personified the continuity between interrogation techniques that the CIA used in Latin America during the 1980s and those that became notorious in the 21st century. Among them were shackling, sleep deprivation, electroshock, cramped confinement, and hooding with sensory deprivation. Psychologists who helped design these techniques emphasized the need to reproduce a prisoner to a state of dependence on the interrogator, precisely what the overseers of MKUltra and the authors of Kubark Manual recommended. When American leaders decided that the 9/11 attacks, that the gloves come off, is CIA counterintelligence chief Cofer Black put it, they were able to draw on a full store of experience, designing a set of techniques for extreme interrogation of Muslim prisoners required nothing more than pulling old manuals out of the drawer, tweaking their recommendations, and passing them on to the interrogator torturers. The hands-off are clear. When Kurt Blom and Shiro Ishii, to the directors of the Bluebird Project, later renamed Artichoke from Artichoke to Gottlieb, and MKUltra from MKUltra to Kubark, counterintelligence interrogation from there to the Human Resources Exploitation Training Manual, and from these manuals to Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, and the CIA black sites around the world. Gottlieb is an indispensable link to this grim chain. History and mortality loom like threatening clouds over an attempt to assess Sidney Gottlieb's life and work. He can be fairly praised as a patriot and just as fairly abhorred as a demonic. Judging from require a deep dive into the human mind and the human soul. Gottlieb was, as is everyone, a product of this world. His parents and the parents of most of his classmates were Jews who fled oppression in Europe. America saved them from the Holocaust. To them, it was the country where, as one son of Jewish immigrants wrote, the dreams that you dare to dream really do come true. Gottlieb could not help being caught up in the patriotic fervor that followed the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, or being crushed when he was deemed unfit to join the Army. The CIA gave him a chance to serve. Many of the Americans' very best men jumped at that chance, so Gottlieb cannot be judged harshly for doing the same. On the contrary, he may be admired for choosing to join the secret elite dedicating to defending the United States against what seemed a fanatic and pitiless enemy. Nor can Gottlieb rightly be censured for his 7 years as chief of the CIA's Technical Services Division. Its nations needed spies. Someone must make the tools that spies use. Gottlieb had the array of talents to excel at that strange job. Another aspect of Gottlieb's work, the preparation of poisons to kill foreign leaders, led to his brief burst of notoriety in the 1970s. That was the dirtiest of jobs. Presidents have been harshly condemned for their decisions to seek the assassination of foreign leaders. All CIA officers who participated in those plots, including Gottlieb, moved in dubious moral territory. The share responsibility with Eisenhower and Kennedy. The weightiest case against Gottlieb is his work running the MK Ultra under someone else's leadership. It might have been far less extreme. Gottlieb not only refused to limit its work, but pushed his contractors to reach and exceed every limit they could imagine. His gruesome sub-projects and his work directing special interrogation at secret prisons around the world resulted in immense human suffering. He was a talented scientist and a faithful civil servant, but also his generation's most prolific torturer. One especially arresting aspect of Gottlieb's ethical calculation was his willingness to work with Nazi scientists who he knew were connected to the torture and murder of Jews in concentration camps. Many of the Americans who worked for these scientists had only general or theoretical reasons to detest Nazism, but easily put their doubts aside as soon as World War II ended and the communism emerged as the new enemy. Gottlieb, though, was not simply Jewish, but one generation removed from the shtetl. If his parents had not left Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, he might well have been forced into a ghetto as a young man and then arrested, sent to a concentration camp, and killed during the lethal experiment. Nonetheless, he worked with the scientists who conducted those experiments. Gottlieb was not a sadist, but he might as well have been. MK Ultra gave him life or death power over other people's minds and bodies. He was a master manipulator, enthralled by the role he played and what allowed him to do, carried away by forces from within him as well as by those that were swirled around him. He justified every sort of brutality. He developed an extraordinary level of psychic tolerance for the violence, abuse of other human beings. Death squad leaders in Latin America sometimes tuck their children tenderly into bed before leaving for nighttime missions of torture and murder. It's much the same in Gottlieb's cheerfulness and community spirit, were a facade that covered his day-to-day work overseeing experiments in which human lives were destroyed. Cold War historians now agree that Americans' fear of Soviet attack was greatly exaggerated. At the time, though, it seemed vividly real. Some intelligence officers have argued that the perceived imminence of that threat justified the CIA's excesses. What you were made to feel was that the country was in desperate peril and that you had to do whatever it took to save it, one said. Another recalled being totally absorbed in something that had become misunderstood now. But the Cold War in these days was a very real thing, with hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, tanks, and planes posed on the East German border, capable of moving the English Channel to the English Channel in just 48 hours. Commitment to a cause provides the ultimate justification for immoral acts. Patriotism is the most seductive of those crimes, of those causes. It posits a nation as a value so transcended that anything done in its service is virtuous. That brings into sharp relief that the essayist Jan Kott called the discrepancy between the moral order and the order of practical behavior. The hearts and the voices of conscience, Kott wrote after a murder, but at the same time realized that conscience cannot be reconciled with the laws and orders of the world he lives in. That is something superfluous and ridiculous and a nuisance. Gottlieb faced a question that cuts to the human heart. And are these limits to the amount of evil that can be done in the righteous cause before the evil outweighs the righteousness? Even if he believed that the limits might exist in theory, or in other cases, he never observed them in his own work. He persuaded himself that he was defending nothing less than the survival of the United States and human freedom on earth. That allowed him to justify grave assaults on human life and dignity. He assumed the role of God, freely destroying the lives of innocents for what he believed were good reasons. That sin was deep. Gottlieb lived with it uncomfortably in his later years. The greatest mechanism in which Gottlieb was a cog gave birth to MKUltra and nurtured it through waves of suffering. Something like it would be exited even if Gottlieb, Helms, Dulles, and Eisenhower had never been born. Behind it lies a quintessential moral trap. Most people are able to distinguish between right and wrong. Some do things they know are wrong for what they consider good reasons. No one else of Gottlieb's generation, however, had the government given power to do so many things that were so profoundly and horrifically wrong. No other American, at least none of that we know of, ever wielded such terrifying life or death power while remaining so completely invisible. Gottlieb saw himself as a spiritual person. The most definitions, though true, special spirituality means that a measure of compassion and mindfulness informed every aspect of a person's life. That was not the case with Gottlieb. Neither his scientific curiosity, his sense of patriotism, or his acts of private charity justify his years of heinous assaults on the lives of others. The last quarter century of Gottlieb's life was exemplary. He became what he liked, to believe that the true Sidney Gottlieb, a caring, selfless community leader, was always ready to help the needy or afflicted. But although he refused to speak about MKUltra, he could not pretend that it did not exist. Memory would have plagued him if he had not faced investigations and lawsuits. Among who believes in divine judgment or karmic payback would be disturbed to look back on a career like his. Gottlieb searched relentlessly for inner peace while just as relentlessly laying waste to other people's minds and bodies. He was a jumble of contradictory archetypes, a creator and a destroyer, an outlaw who served power, a gentle heart torturer. All of the above was an instrument of his history. Understanding him is a deeply disturbing way of understanding ourselves. And that is the last of this book. There's one afterthought called Afterword to the paperback edition, which will probably be the last reading of this book ever. So if you think there's any truth in that book or what I'm saying here, please like and subscribe and have a nice day. Thank you.